In another video, I looked at Roderick Chisholm's views on identity over time in regards to objects such as ships and cars and so on. And here we're looking at personal identity over time. The question of what are the criteria for being the same person at one time as you were at a time in the past or as you will be at some future time. And Roderick Chisholm is one of the most prominent metaphysicians of the 20th century, but in this case, he has a very unique view that others rarely get on board with. And so what is Chisholm's criteria for personal identity? Well, let's remind ourselves of the formal way to present the problem. You can present it as a question. A person P2 at T2 is the same person as P1 at T1 if and only if what? So a person at one time is the same person as a person at another time under what conditions? What are the criteria that go in the blank? And Chisholm's response is there is the same person if and only if the same tiny physical particle that is the person exists both at T2 and at T1 at one time and another. So same tiny physical particle, that is what we are, according to Chism. Now, this is a double aspect theory, his terminology, the idea that there is something that has a dual aspect. It is both physical in nature and mental in nature, and I am identical with that thing. And of course, you are identical with a different dual aspect physical particle that is mental as well and is very tiny. Now, Chisholm thinks the theory is well grounded. Primarily what we're going to do here is explain a little bit more what he means by this, why he's motivated to take the position, and then some objections that might be raised against the position. So if you're a physicalist, a reasonable question to ask is, which physical thing am I? And so as Chisholm investigates the question, and he does assume that we are a physical thing of one sort or another, or rather he argues against the traditional dualism of the kind that Plato or Descartes held, the obvious response for physicalists is typically the idea that I am this physical body, whatever people can see or observe, or maybe a proper part of it. And typically that proper part would be someone's brain, which relatively speaking is a fairly large organ, right? But my physical body, says Chisholm, is an ens successivum. That is, it is a thing that persists by having various parts at different times. Even since the time we started this video, you and I have lost some parts and gained some parts. How did we do that? Simply by breathing. If you've rubbed your finger against something, you've probably lost some skin cells also, for example. Your body might be digesting something that you've eaten and taking that in to your body and making it part of your body. So our physical body continues to gain parts and lose parts over time. And our bodies thus are like the ship of Theseus, the ship where he starts out and then a plank is taken off and replaced. And for our bodies, it's actually about every 7 years, says the current physiologist and chemist and physicist, that every atom in our body is replaced just by the processes that I've already mentioned and others as well. Any atom that's in our body now won't be there 7 years from now and wasn't there 7 years in the past. So if our bodies are like that, there seem to be a couple problems, says Chisholm. So specifically, let's consider two issues with saying that we are identical with our body. One problem is to say that, well, if I'm my body, and this is how Chisholm handled anything that exists over time, but exists by having different parts, right? Has some parts now at one time and other parts at a different time, then my persistence is a matter of convention. That's what Chisholm said we ought to do when it comes to things like ships or cars or possessions like that. And you can let the court or the jury decide if it's the same ship or not. So the problem, though, for Chisholm is he's very confident that my persistence is not a matter of convention. And if it's not, then I can't be my body. So another issue that comes up is, am I something that exists by having different stand-ins for me at various times? And this is roughly the view of David Lewis and person stages with his temporal parts that exist at different times. But Chisholm says, no, it's not one thing that is depressed for me one day and then something else that is happy for me on another day. That doesn't make sense to him. It's me that is depressed or was depressed last week, or me that's now happy or will be happy next week, right? It's ourselves that have these characteristics. Now, here's his argument to reject bodily identity. So suppose I am now sad. Okay, so we'll just consider this idea. Say a person is sad, so I am now sad. Now, if there is an ens successivum that bears my name and is now sad, then it's sad in virtue of the fact that one of its stand-ins is sad. One of its compositions at one time is sad. So that's how you would have to describe it if you were an ens successivum, one that continues to exist over time by having different parts at different times, or at least some parts replaced at different times. But I'm not sad in virtue of some other thing that is sad for me. Chisholm says that doesn't make sense, so therefore I'm not an ens successivum. That's not who I am. And that also means that I am not identical with my body. Now, if we say we're not identical with our body, or no person is identical with their body, then what are the options, right? If you're not a physical body, but you are something that's physical, what other options are there? Well, you can't be an ens successivum because you have all the problems we just mentioned. So Chisholm says, I must be something that persists and does not change parts. Now, we just described how the physical body is constantly changing parts, but we also said that we're not an ens successivum according to Chisholm's rationale. So we could say that I am an ens non successivum, or an ENS, we might say for short, so I don't have to keep saying that odd phrase. That is, when we say, for example, that I remember injuring my shoulder last year, it was me who injured my shoulder. That is a strict identity. That's not a loose identity, as Chisholm talks about elsewhere. And an ENS must exist anyway in order for an ens successivum to exist. So you have to have that. And so what could we be, considering everything that we said about the body, except having a part, or being a part of a body that, strictly speaking, never changes parts? A small physical particle that never exchanges parts, never changes parts. So in this case, that is part of the body that doesn't change every 7 years. It is something that is if you hear sirens, everything's safe. Don't worry about it. Sorry for that interruption. But in any case, that physical particle that you are never changes any parts of it with anything over your lifetime. Now, how does this relate to dualism? This is somewhat similar to dualism, but clearly it's a physicalism. Well, he's obviously not a dualist like Plato or like Descartes, because people are physical things. So he's committed to being a physicalist. But he's not a typical physicalist at all, since he claims that we use our eyes to see just as we use glasses to see. It's a tool for us. Our eyes are kind of like tools that we use to see. And like a dualist, and this is Descartes kind of, well, this is a description that Descartes had for what we are in relation to our body. He said that a person is in a body somewhat the same way as a sailor or a captain is in a ship. So Chism agrees with that imagery, that we're in a body, but we're not the full body, just like a captain is in a ship, but is not the whole ship. So clearly there are going to be a few objections to this view. So let's see how Chism responds to some of these questions. Well, one objection is that his hypothesis implies that there's some incorruptible matter, right? There has to be that physical particle that never actually exchanges atoms or anything over your lifetime. And that goes against physics. We all know there's no such thing as incorruptible matter. So that seems to be a problem. Now, his response is no, he's not committed to something that is incorrupted. He's committed to something that's incorrupted as long as a person lives. Now, where is this saying, or what is this saying? Most likely, it's this microscopic particle in the brain. As long as you live, that little particle is incorrupted. So he's not making something that it violates what's known about physics. Second objection and his response. Persons, as thinking things, must have a complex structure, right? Anything that thinks has to have a complex structure, but tiny particles don't have a complex structure. And this is why some people would say, of course, that you're not your whole body, but you're identical with your brain, maybe. Now, Chism responds that, well, yes, I have a brain, and it's the organ of consciousness, but it's not the subject of consciousness. And that's a very important distinction. So Chism could say it's similar to the nose being the organ for smelling, but not the subject of smelling, or the ear being the organ for hearing, but not the subject of hearing. I use my brain in this sense, just like I might use a computer. So as a tiny physical particle, you make use of a brain, but doesn't mean that the brain itself is the subject of consciousness. Okay, we'll revisit this concern after another objection. People would say something like, well, I'm 6 feet tall and a tiny particle is not. And there you can respond with some paraphrase. And Chism says, look, you're just taking too seriously the claim that I'm 6 feet tall. You're not 6 feet tall. So technically speaking, no, you're not taller than, let's say, a cat is, for example. You're not taller than that. You say that you are on your driver's license. You might say that you are when you meet somebody. But there's a paraphrase that's easily available to him. I have a body that is 6 feet tall. So that seems to make sense. So one more objection is just this statement of disbelief I weigh less than a milligram, and that seems to be what Chisholm is committed to. So his response is yes. And again, paraphrase is going to help us out here. So sometimes you might be at an event, you meet somebody there whom you know, and you decide to go someplace else afterwards. And so you say, where are you parked? I'm parked in the queue lot. Well, of course, you yourself are not parked anywhere, let alone in the queue lot, but you can borrow properties from your car when you talk in this way, just like you can borrow properties from your body. And it's even more natural, of course, when we borrow properties from our body. So we can say things like, yes, my body, or you might tell somebody, I'm 6 feet tall, because your body is 6 feet tall. You might tell somebody that you weigh 100 kilograms when it's your body that weighs 100 kilograms. Anyone who sees me would recognize that it's not me who weighs 100 kilograms. I am shy of that by quite a bit. In any case, more objections and responses. If we say Chisholm is right, if a person is a tiny particle, as Chisholm describes, then here is an issue that might happen, considering all the things we raise with personal identity concerns. A person could trade brains with somebody else. If you could find you, the tiny particle that is you, in your brain, you could take it out and put it in somebody else's brain and take them out and put it in your brain. But our consciousness, our beliefs, our desires, our memories, our perceptions, that's what we are. But that would apparently go with our brains, right? That those things are things that brains have, it seems. So if you did that bizarre kind of operation, if Chisholm is right, that seems to be really problematic. So how does Chisholm respond to this challenge, which does seem to be one of the most serious challenges? Here's his response. The person is not identical with consciousness. Instead, we usually use consciousness as a criterion for being the same person. It's a means to identify the person. It's a fairly reliable way to knowing whether or not one is the same person as another in the past or in the future, because these things don't occur. But consciousness itself, Chisholm argues, does not make the person who they are. Tracking consciousness is usually really good evidence that a person's the same person, but it doesn't guarantee it, because you are a tiny physical particle that uses a brain that has consciousness. Now that's a fairly big bullet to bite, we might say, but here's the conclusion of Chisholm. He says, look, there's no reasons to think that persons are non-physical. So he doesn't go to dualism in the traditional or classical sense. But if that's not the case, it seems that a person must be a proper part of his body, some subportion of their body. And that's Chisholm's view. You are a tiny particle in a brain. So he closes out with this kind of idea on this position. It's kind of this odd, well, if you don't like my position, you're welcome to try to formulate a more plausible one. But Chisholm considers himself to explored all of the other plausible options and seen those woefully lacking. They're just problematic. And so that pushes him to this position. Now, as I hinted early in the video, very few people have gotten on board with this view, but it is an interesting way of addressing the problem.